I'm going to invite us to do two things this morning. The first one is this: to consider, what is it that you need to be freed from? What is it that binds you in this moment, in this place in your life, that you need to be freed from? When I was originally thinking about that, I was thinking, what is it that we want to be freed from? And my guess is there's probably lots of things that we want to be freed from. But what is it that you need to be freed from? And my guess is that's probably just one or two things. So as we're together for a few moments to hold that. And then I'm going to invite you to write down 4 phrases that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes. They're just 4 2-word phrases drawn from this story of Jesus and Lazarus that I sat with this week and that were really helpful for me, and maybe they'll be helpful for you. And if you don't have a pen and something to write on, and you do have our First Congregational Church app, you can just open the app and touch sermon notes, and there'll be a place for you to put all 4 of those things in there. And the first phrase is this. So Mary, or Martha, was talking to Jesus as Jesus had been delayed, and Lazarus, his friend, had died. The family, those gathered, were a little bit incredulous and a little bit upset that this had been allowed to happen. And Jesus, once he got there, asked them to roll away the stone from the tomb. Martha, it's always Martha, isn't it? Sees the reality of the situation. And the NRSV says it so nicely. He's been in for a while. There's going to be a stench. I prefer the King James Version for this particular verse 35, I think it is, where Martha says, "Lord, he stinketh." So that's the first phrase I'm going to encourage us to jot down. He stinketh. Is we're on the path to liberation. Is we're searching for freedom in those things that we need to be unbound from. I think the first thing is to name the issue that we're dealing with. To name the reality that we're facing. You know, sometimes we have this general sense that we need to be freed for something, but we don't want to take the time or take the courage to face what it really is that we need to be unbound from. It might be a dependence that we have on a certain behavior or a certain substance. And maybe it's something that we've beaten in the past, but as the years have progressed, it's kind of snuck back into our life. And we don't want to admit it. We don't want to face it. But gradually we find ourselves bound again by that. Sometimes it might be a relationship that we're involved in that's become unhealthy, and we've been bound by that. And it might need to be something that we take a couple of steps back from and to name what is actually happening. It's really difficult to do. I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with my boss, and I work in hospice. I work in home health care at the end of life, and there's just a tremendous amount of moving parts. And on a daily basis, several things go wrong. There's always things that are going wrong, that happen that aren't supposed to happen, or that didn't happen that were supposed to happen. And so we're constantly having to look for those and name those. And there was something that came up where there were 3 incidents, 3 service failures, as we call them, that all revolved around the same issue. And so we were sitting there talking about it, and all of a sudden our general manager says, sometimes you just have to call the baby ugly. And so there was a pause, and we were all just kind of sitting there for one reason, because that was almost funny, and our boss isn't funny at all. So that kind of took us aback. And then none of us had ever heard that phrase before. And so we were sitting there in silence, and she says, sometimes you just have to call things what they are. And so I've been thinking about that for the past 2 weeks, and I have not come up with any scenario where it's helpful to call a baby ugly. I mean, maybe there is, but I haven't heard of it. But sometimes babies are ugly. In any event besides that, sometimes there's some courage that's needed and some insight that's needed to call something what it is. Sometimes we need to Martha up, or sometimes we might need to invite a Martha into our life that's not afraid to say, "He stinketh." Because sometimes we can't get free from things because we haven't taken the time to name and examine what they are. He stinketh. The next phrase is this. And if you grew up in a biblical tradition like I did, you would know this because we were always crazy about Bible trivia. And John 11:35 is the shortest verse in the Bible. John 11:35 says, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Jesus cried. What a great reminder for us. That sometimes as we're on the journey of liberation, there's some grief that's involved in that. And you know what? The appropriate response to grief is to cry. Jesus wept is such a powerful reminder to me, especially in a day and age where we don't like to cry. I do a lot of funerals, and a lot of times people don't want to even call them funerals anymore. Funeral homes have become event centers. And so you go and hors d'oeuvres are passed, and there's an open bar, and it's said over and over again that Grandma Sue wouldn't want us to cry, she would want us to celebrate. And indeed, there's nothing wrong with celebrating someone's life. And I used to press back against that a little bit, but I don't anymore, because here's what I know. That even in a celebration of life, there's someone that's not going to get the memo. Or there's someone that's going to get the memo and not be able to abide. And not to stereotype, but quite often that's a granddaughter in their late teens or early 20s that gets up in front of the group and nervously looks through her iPhone for the notes that she jotted down. And she'll start to talk about her grandmother, who read her stories, who took her shopping, who bought her ice cream. The grandmother whose house that she stayed at overnight while her parents were going through a divorce. The grandmother that called with words of encouragement when she dropped out of college after the first semester. And by this time, other family members are looking away because those are the stinky things that we don't like to talk about. But they were things that meant something to her. And she'll make it halfway through and she'll break down and start crying. And then I have the awesome privilege of walking up and putting my arm around her shoulder and in front of everybody saying, thank you for giving us the opportunity and the permission to cry, to grieve. As we seek to be unbound, there's sadness that comes with that. I was sad yesterday when I couldn't get a funnel cake at the Pride Festival, because I knew that if I ate a funnel cake that I wouldn't have the energy to make it through the rest of the day and do what I needed to do. Thankful for Jolynn, who gave me a piece of hers to kind of tide me over. I'm sad when I have to say no to somebody, because I can so easily get caught up in everything that I'm doing and performing that I start doing too much. And sometimes I have to say no to opportunities and things that I'm requested to do. And that grieves me. Some of us might be sad that we're going to have to drag ourselves downtown tomorrow night in West Palm Beach and take up the evening in traffic and in waiting in order to confront systems of injustice in our community, and to call things what they are and to ask for reform. There's grief. There's sadness involved in that. When I drive past a Publix and shop at 3 other places that are incredibly inconvenient because I don't want to give Publix my money because of the way that they treat those that oftentimes harvest their produce, I'm a little bit sad about that. And that's okay. It's appropriate. Jesus wept. Another reminder from Jesus wept is that God is in the midst of our grief with us. I've devoted most of my life to spiritual practice. And you know what? I still fall into this trap, this mess of thinking that the spiritual life is about getting my shit together enough so that God will be more accepting of me. That's not what spirituality about. That's not what Christian spirituality is about. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, is our reminder that God is with us in the shit, whether it's together or not. When I'm filled with rage at someone that cuts me off on the highway and I can feel the redness go up my head, Emmanuel, God is with us. When we're just trying to get our stuff together and we fall into the same patterns of behavior that trip us up every single time, Emmanuel, God is with us. When we're filled with anxiety and frustration at the state attorney who is supposed to get a written statement to us about policy as far as juveniles and civil citations 2 months ago, and he hasn't done it yet, and is going to come to our action in front of 1,500 people and probably make excuses for that. God is with us in the midst of that. Jesus wept. He cried. He knew Lazarus was dead before he got the news, but still he cried. He knew Lazarus would be alive again in a matter of moments, but still he cried. He knew this world was not his home. He knew death here is not forever. He knew eternity in the kingdom better than anyone else could, and still he cried. Because this world is full of pain and regret and loss and depression and disappointment. He cried because knowing the end of the story doesn't mean you can't cry at the sad parts. Jesus wept. And then Jesus goes to the mouth of that empty tomb. And he calls into the darkness. he calls into the death, come out. That's the third two-word phrase. Lazarus, come out. Some translations say come forth. I love the way the NRSV claims that. Come out, especially on this Pride weekend. Come out, Lazarus. Be full of life. Claim who you are and come out. Yes, there are things that bind you. Yes, there are things that continue to trip us up and that we need to be freed from. But Lazarus, take the first step. Come out. And Lazarus does. And you might be thinking, you know what, Jason, that sounds great, but you don't know what it is that binds me. How in the world can I come out from that? Do you read the newspapers? Look at what's happening in the world. How in the world can we have hope? How in the world can we come out of that? I don't know. I also don't know how what I always have thought of as a commuter college in Boca Raton is now in the Final Four. How does that happen? Come out. When we hear that call of God, when we hear the call of Christ, Emmanuel, God with us in the midst of everything, how do we respond? Can we take the first step? Can we come out? I was listening to an interview with James Clear, who's the author of Atomic Habits, just a fantastic book. And he was talking about this gentleman that wanted to get in shape and just had a hard time doing that. And he said, he took the first step. The first step for him was for 2 weeks, getting up in the morning and driving to the gym, sitting in the parking lot, and then driving back home again. It was a start. It was a first step. The promise of our faith is that no matter what the situation is, we can always hear and lean on the call of Christ to come out. There is always that place we can go. There's always that voice we can be listening for, as the psalmist told us this morning, more than the watchman waits for the morning. And then he said it again, more than the watchman waits for the morning. Come out. And come out Lazarus did, but we're told that he was still bound. And I know this is a pretty dramatic text, but do you see the comedy in that? So here's Lazarus coming out of the tombstone, his arms and his legs still bound, so he's probably wiggling like this. And Jesus turns to the people that are around and says, don't just stand there. And the fourth phrase is this: unbind him. We hear the call of Jesus. Come out. We respond to that. We do the best that we can to struggle out. And then the voice of Jesus, the divine call, is for those around to start to participate in this work and engage the unbinding of one another. When we see someone that's responding to the call of God to new life in their life, we have the opportunity to come alongside them and help them in that process. When we see people that hear the call of God in their life and are doing their best to respond, but are oppressed by systems of injustice, we have the opportunity to use our power, to use our resources, to engage the process of helping to unbind them, tearing away the grave clothes. That's what we have the opportunity of doing as a community of faith. All of us have different calls. All of us have different ways of responding to those. How might we be open to one another? How might we join one another on the journey to freedom, to liberation, to casting off the things that bind us? To help one another, to help our world, which has wonderful impulses, that hears the call, maybe not in exactly the same way that we do, but that knows that there's something better, knows that we can throw off these chains that bind us, these chains of addiction and economics and behaviors and angers and prejudices. Do we hear the words of Jesus? Unbind them. As they take the first steps to respond to my call on their life. Unbind them. He stinketh. Jesus wept. Come out. Unbind him. Let's pray together.